The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Happy Wednesday, everyone. My name is Anna Hobson. I'm from HR Simple, and I will be moderating today. Welcome to today's webinar, The COVID-19 Vaccine, What Employers Need to Know to Manage the Workplace. Our presenters today are Heather and Antonio from Lehner Mukin. The presentation today will be about an hour long. If you have any questions, please submit them in the question box, and I will forward those along to the attorneys. If you would like to watch more webinars, please go to hrsimple.com/events, and you will see a listing of webinars from our partners like Lehner Mukin. HR Simple provides federal and state-specific manuals. We make employment law easy. Our books are written by top labor attorneys from top firms such as Lehner Mukin, who authors the Illinois Human Resources Manual. To find out more information, you can go to hrsimple.com. Now I'm going to hand things over to the attorneys so we can learn a little bit more about them and the firm before we get started.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Hello, everybody. As Anna said, my name is Antonio Calderon, and I'm here with one of my partners, Heather Becker. We want to thank everyone for taking the time out today and attending the webinar. If you're not familiar with Lehner Mukin, we are one of the oldest labor and employment law firms, having celebrated our 75th anniversary last year, and let me tell you what a year it was. We weren't able to even celebrate it together, but we're going 75 years strong. Our firm partners with human resources professionals, in-house counsel, and business leaders to ensure compliance with all areas of labor and employment law, including day-to-day employment counseling, labor relations, business immigration, employee benefits, and employment litigation. Heather and I are two members of Lehner Mukin's COVID-19 task force. We are also partners in our litigation group. Our practice involves defending employers in class action cases, specifically in wage and hour, and other employment-related claims such as discrimination, harassment, retaliation, whistleblower, and non-competes. A large portion, however, of our practice, and one I would say we enjoy the most, is preventative counseling in a variety of day-to-day employment issues, and of course, developing management training programs like this one. So enough about us. It's been a year now, and I feel like Heather and I did our first COVID-19 webinar yesterday. So much has happened, and I think it's safe to say that no one would believe we'd still be here today talking about COVID-19. Personally, I look forward to getting back into my suits and in the courtroom, and hopefully all my suits still fit. Speaking of hope, I really hope that we don't need to be doing these COVID-19 webinars for much longer, which brings me why we're all here today. There's been much talk and anticipation about the COVID-19 vaccine, or I should say vaccines, and what this means for all of us. Employers are particularly interested in what it means for their employees and whether they can mandate vaccines. Today, Heather and I will walk you through this topic from both a legal and a practical perspective. Here's today's agenda. The first thing we're going to talk about is the emergency use authorization and what that means. We're going to then go into what public health officials are saying about COVID-19, whether employers, and I think this is really a hot topic, can mandate the vaccine, and what they should consider before implementing a mandate. Alternatives to mandating the vaccine would be very important and helpful to know, and we're going to talk about that. And then finally, traditional labor and union considerations. So let's talk about the emergency use authorization. I'm sure that is a term I didn't know about until a few months ago, and I'm sure all of us now know about it. Currently, there are two vaccines that are approved by the FDA for emergency use authorization. One is made by Pfizer, and the other one is made by Moderna. Johnson & Johnson recently applied for emergency use authorization. and we're waiting for that approval. So what an emergency use authorization means is it allows the use of unapproved medical products in an emergency to prevent or treat serious diseases. So at this point, there's been some clinical trials, and now the FDA has determined that the known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks. Now, what I will say is this is emergency use. So the vaccines are continuing their clinical trials to obtain additional safety and effectiveness before they obtain full licensure, or let's call it final approval. And that's why, if you've heard, the Pfizer vaccine is only approved for people who are 16 years and older, and the Moderna vaccine is only approved for people who are 18 years and older. And the reason for that is there are a lot of unknowns. These tests up till now have not done a lot with younger people. So obviously under 16 for Pfizer and under 18 for Moderna. There's also a lot of unknowns. For example, pregnancy. There's been some back and forth. Initially, there was some concerns about whether there was enough information about the impact on the fetus from these vaccines. And recently, some healthcare providers have taken the position that, you know, people who are pregnant should talk about that with their doctor and may not necessarily be prohibited or be advised not to take it. Other unknowns, sorry, my slides are going here. Other unknowns could be person-to-person transmission. They don't know yet for sure if the vaccine will prohibit a vaccinated person from still transmitting COVID-19 to other people, okay? And of course, we all know that the COVID vaccine isn't 100% effective. So a lot of these unknowns are seen. So when we get more information, you know, things can change. For example, recently and earlier this month, South Africa suspended the use of a vaccine by AstraZeneca when it was determined that it was less effective because there is a COVID-19 variant in South Africa. So again, while emergency use, we're under an emergency use authorization, there's a lot of variables still out there and what employers should know before implementing mandatory policies. Now, the FDA has issued a fact sheet to inform the public of the known and unknown risks. And if some of you may have gotten the COVID-19 vaccine, but you're provided with this information sheet. And we have a link to it at the end of our presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Heather to talk about vaccine mandates.
Thanks, Antonio, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So now we've got the vaccine, and as Antonio said, we've actually got 2 vaccines that are currently approved under the emergency use authorization. So now what? There is no current mandate or requirement that an individual be vaccinated, but public health officials have a consistent message for all individuals over the age of 16. Get the vaccination as soon as you're eligible. Vaccination is safe and effective. The CDC even recommends, as Antonio said, that individuals who have already contracted COVID-19 obtain the vaccine. Seems simple, right? But so far, the vaccine rollout has been anything but simple. There are 2 primary reasons for this. The first is an issue of supply and demand. It takes time to make the vaccine, and production isn't even close to where it needs to be to vaccinate our entire population. The second issue is distribution. While the CDC has made recommendations, the state and local governments are responsible for distribution. And as with all things, some states have better plans than others, and some are better at executing their plans than others. So where we are today is that according to the CDC, from December 14th, when the vaccine first began being administered, up through yesterday, 55 million doses have been administered. But remember, to be fully vaccinated, you need 2 doses of the vaccine. So what that means is out of the 55 million doses, about 40 million have gone to individuals for their first dose. The other 15 million have gone to individuals for their second dose. So what that means is, as of yesterday, about 15 million people within the United States are fully vaccinated. That's really only a small fraction of our population, perhaps around 4% of our population. I received several questions from clients in the past week or so asking when their employees are going to become eligible for the vaccine. The vaccine rollout is being conducted in phases, as you know, and so far there's about 15 million individuals who have been vaccinated. Most of those individuals are healthcare workers, workers in long-term residential facilities, and people over the age of 65. As supply increases, we're going to see that access is going to open up to more and more individuals, including a term that you've probably heard of, essential workers. Now, remember in the early days of the pandemic when everything was shutting down and businesses were grappling with can they stay open or not? At that point, we were talking about who's an essential worker, who needs to keep their operations running so that they can keep the economy running, keep people fed, and kind of keep the gears running that need to run, even in the midst of a shutdown. At that time, the term essential worker was actually quite broad, and it encompassed millions of jobs that you wouldn't even consider to be essential if you were trying to think about what the essential jobs are off the top of your head. What we're now seeing that as state and local governments are starting to plan for the vaccine rollout, that term essential worker is being narrowed. So when you hear that your state or local government is vaccinating essential workers and you were part of a company where your workforce kept working and kept showing up every day and at the beginning stages, it doesn't necessarily mean that your employees are going to be eligible for the vaccine. What we're starting to see is they're taking that term essential worker and then taking subsets of that and selecting what groups of people are going to be vaccinated. And it's simply because there isn't enough demand for everybody in that group. What we're also starting to see is every state's different. Every state is prioritizing who gets the vaccine first. Some, like here in Illinois, are giving it to healthcare or are giving it to teachers, educators. Other states haven't opened it up to those individuals yet and instead are focusing on individuals with pre-existing conditions or serious medical conditions that could be exacerbated by COVID-19. So when it comes to access, when it comes to eligibility, really, if you as an employer want to talk to your employees about that, you really need to look at what are the job duties that they're performing and what are my state specific requirements. Now, once the vaccines start to catch up with supply, you can imagine we're going to start to see state and local governments talking about mandating vaccines, particularly in some industries, public safety roles, healthcare workers, or persons in long-term facilities who so far have received priority. For a lot of those industries, mandating the COVID-19 vaccine is going to be no different eventually than it is when they mandate the flu vaccine or the hepatitis B vaccine. And there's no question that every facet of our workforce has been impacted by the vaccine, from whole facility shutdowns and layoffs to just how we interact with one another. The fact that we're having webinars these days and conference calls as opposed to face-to-face meetings. So as you can imagine, most employers are starting to talk about, can they mandate vaccines and what does that mean for their workforce? The short answer is it's really complicated. So far, all the state and federal guidance we've seen has suggested that employers will be able to mandate vaccines, but there's going to be a lot of caveats to that. There are legal and practical considerations that you'll need to consider as you're heading down the path of employer-mandated vaccine. And there's lots of exceptions to the rule. So let's start. I'm going to turn it over to Antonio to talk about the legal considerations of mandating the vaccine.
Thanks, Heather. So, of course, no one likes to talk about the legal considerations, but more importantly, Heather's going to talk later about the practical considerations, and I think that's what's going to impact everyone day to day. But we have to start somewhere, and I think having a baseline of what the state and federal government agencies are saying. So the main one that comes into play is the EEOC, and they issued guidance on December 16th of 2020 and they issued new guidance for employers who want to mandate employees to take the COVID-19 vaccine. According to the EEOC, employers can require it with some caveats. So there's really three main laws that come into play. One is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Two is Title VII. And three is GINA, which is the federal law known as the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So let's talk about the ADA. For those of you HR professionals, you're quite familiar with the ADA. And generally speaking, the ADA prohibits, in many cases, medical examinations or disability-related inquiries. Now, the EEOC says the COVID-19 is not a medical examination, so you're good on that one. So then the next question is mandating or showing proof of a vaccination a disability-related inquiry? And the answer is no. So you can ask for proof of a vaccination without any problems. The problem is when you ask follow-up questions. So, for example, an employee says, I cannot receive the COVID-19 vaccine, and you ask why. Then they tell you, well, I have this disability, I have this family medical issue, this genetic issue, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's where things get a little bit murky. So you can make, under what the EEOC says, is you can make a disability-related inquiry as if it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. So employers would have to have a reasonable, according to EEOC, a reasonable objective evidence that employees who do not answer questions or do not receive a vaccination will pose a direct threat to the health and safety of the employee or others. If an employee cannot receive the COVID vaccine, then and you want to exempt them, right, because you have to engage in an interactive process and you need an accommodation, then of course you have to engage in the interactive process. And one is, as we all know, the interactive process involves getting medical documentation showing that the employee can't receive the COVID vaccine, and here's why. And part of that is, okay, so what other accommodations could we provide? Is working from home an accommodation? Is providing personal protective equipment an accommodation? Is providing a leave of absence depending on the disability, if it's a temporary medical condition that can be addressed through working from home or a temporary leave of absence. So those are just some of the examples. Is sometimes workplaces you can separate an employee who's unvaccinated. But the bottom line is, when treating someone unvaccinated differently, okay, you have to look at these accommodations. Now, if you want to completely exclude this person from the workforce, okay, then the employee, that you have to determine that the employee poses a direct threat to their safety or the safety of the others that cannot be eliminated or reduced through an accommodation. When talking about accommodations, I think it's important that if an employer implements a mandatory policy, the persons who are responsible for communicating that and responsible for enforcing that, whether it be HR, sometimes it's frontline managers, just like with any accommodation issue, they should know how to handle the situation. They should know when to recognize an accommodation request and the appropriate channels to go about doing it, okay? Especially if it's your frontline managers or supervisors that this might be new to them. You don't want someone to say, oh, you didn't get the vaccine, well, you can't work here, right? You want to be able to go through the proper channels, okay? The EEOC, interestingly enough, has said that as more people get vaccinated, the prevalence in the workplace of employees who have already received the COVID-19 vaccination and their amount of contacts with others may impact whether you should may impact how you treat unvaccinated people. So what does this mean? Well, the EEOC says, well, at some point, if a large enough percentage of your workforce is vaccinated, then the direct threat of an unvaccinated employee goes down. Okay, so that's the EEOC's position. And then, of course, if there are no accommodations available, which includes, mind you, work from home, PPE, those sorts of things, then the last resort is to determine, is there another job that this person is qualified to perform and can perform if they're unvaccinated? Then, of course, if the answer is no, then you can exclude or terminate them. But there's a lot of hoops to jump through. Now let's go to GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Okay. GINA prohibits employers from using genetic information to make employment-related decisions and acquiring genetic information and disclosing genetic information, with some exceptions. So basically under GINA, unless there's some exceptions, you can't ask for employees' history of genetic ask for their genetic information. You can't ask for family medical history that may result in disclosing genetic information. However, mandating the COVID-19 vaccine in and of itself alone, or requiring proof of vaccination, does not run afoul of GINA. Because if you're requiring the vaccine, you're not getting genetic information, or you're requiring proof that an employee has taken the vaccine, you're not getting genetic information. But like the ADA issue, where you run into a potential problem is getting information. So for example, doctors and persons who are administering the vaccines are advised to go through ask some pre-screening questions. And it may involve family medical history and employees' health history, and that may require the disclosure of genetic information or family medical history, and that may violate GINA. Now, if you use a third party to administer tests, or you tell employees, just get your vaccine, I don't care where you get it, go to Walgreens or CVS or the Duane Reade, if you do that, then you're fine, because you're not getting this information and it's not being shared with you. That's what's important. Now, the other piece is, again, if an employee says, I couldn't get the vaccine and I need an accommodation, and you ask why, that may, again, implicate GINA. So what I recommend is issue the person a warning, and not a disciplinary warning, but a disclaimer. And you say, listen, I don't want you, if you're going to provide proof, or if you're going to provide proof or require proof, then inform the employee, do not share any genetic information with me. Do not share this proof. Then, of course, if the employee does it, then you're protected because you did not ask for it or make an inquiry into it. The other piece, Title VII. So another accommodation that employers would need to consider is accommodations for sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance that prohibits an employee from getting the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, what I will say is the definition under Title VII, the way EEOC has interpreted, is a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance is very broad and would not be necessarily limited to the more common religions or practices or observances that a lot of us might be familiar with. So you are limited in what follow-up questions to ask, okay, as far as what the belief is, okay? And you can ask for it when there is an objective basis for questioning its sincerity. So if you have an objective basis for questioning when someone says, I have a religious problem or a religious observance and I can't, my religion prevents me from taking the COVID-19 vaccine, Many times the employee might ask, okay, or the employee might tell you why. You can ask why, well, what is it? And then if they tell you and you have an objective basis for questioning the sincerity, then you can ask for documentation or more information. Like the ADA, you must accommodate unless it would pose an undue hardship, which is more than just a de minimis cost or an inconvenience. And again, you go back to the similar accommodation analysis and interactive process that you would and that we talked about under the ADA. All right, another federal agency. So we talked about the EEOC and the laws that the EEOC enforces. Now let's talk about OSHA. OSHA has not issued guidance on whether employers can mandate the COVID-19 vaccine, but it has said that employers should make the vaccine available at no cost, and that employers should not distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. Now, it's unclear what that means because, of course, like many federal agencies, they tell you things and then they don't really explain it, right? So the guidance says that workers who are vaccinated must still continue to follow protective measures, wearing face coverings, remaining physically, socially distant if possible, wearing other forms of PPE, washing hands, those sorts of things, okay? You still have to do that even if someone's vaccinated, according to OSHA. And also, a lot of these mandates are from state and local officials as well. So you're gonna have to do it anyway. The other thing OSHA says when you can't distinguish between the two is that there's not enough evidence that the vaccine prevents transmission from person to person, okay? We mentioned that earlier. So because of all this, OSHA says, okay, we're not prohibiting you from mandating it, but these are some considerations you need to come into play. Two other points to make. Regardless of whether you can mandate or non-mandate, there are OSHA's other obligations still apply. The general duty clause to protect employees, okay? And other standards like I talked about before, PPE, but also respiratory protection, sanitation. And then of course, OSHA does have whistleblower protections. So when implementing a mandatory vaccine requirement, you want to keep in mind that if employees refuse the vaccine because they've expressed safety concerns, that may, OSHA's whistleblower protections may be implicated. So that is another reason that before you go down this path from a legal perspective, and all the reasons I talked about earlier, there's a lot of considerations you want to take into account. So those are the practical consideration or the legal considerations. Now let's turn it over to Heather to talk about the practical considerations.
Thanks, Antonio. When it comes to practical considerations, there are several. Let's start with implementation. As I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, supply is short and demand is very large. So until the vaccine rollout results in more vaccine available to more individuals, and there are more workers that are eligible to get the vaccine, any employer who wants a vaccine mandate is going to face an uphill battle. So that's the first part, is we just need to wait until the supply catches up with the demand and eligibility is widespread. Another thing to consider is that the vaccine doesn't replace many of the preventative measures that employers have put into place in the past year. Now, the CDC is indicating that a fully vaccinated individual who meets certain criteria may not need to quarantine after being exposed to an individual with COVID-19. So that's good news, and that is certainly a change that's come about because of the vaccine. That being said, many of the other precautions are still going to be in place for quite some time. That includes wearing face masks, practicing social distancing, and engaging in other preventative measures, such as not gathering in groups. According to the CDC, there's just not enough information currently available to say if or when they're going to stop recommending these measures. The experts need to first understand more about the protection that the COVID-19 vaccine provides in real-world conditions. And there are several factors that are going to go into those recommendations, including how many people are vaccinated, how the virus is spreading, and most recently, how the vaccine is going to respond to these new variants of the virus that we're starting to see. So in the meantime, regardless of a vaccine mandate, and regardless of whether your employees are vaccinated in the workplace voluntarily or not, the CDC is still recommending that everyone wear a mask over their nose and mouth. Everyone stay at least 6 feet apart from each other when possible, to avoid crowds, to avoid poorly ventilated spaces, and to continue practicing good hygiene, such as washing your hands frequently. These precautions, it's probably safe to say, aren't going away anytime soon. And then there's the issue of enforcement. You know, as employers, and I say this to my clients all the time, there's no point having a rule unless you're prepared to enforce it and to follow through on the penalties for noncompliance. So the first step of enforcement is that you need to come up with a detailed policy detailing that the COVID vaccine will be mandated, detailing what the exceptions are to that mandate, and then setting forth for employees what the consequences are if they don't fall into one of those exceptions and they still refuse the vaccine. And then the next step for enforcement is consistent, fair administration. Of course, the more we start taking into account all of the legal exceptions to mandating the vaccine, your actions are going to look less and less consistent, because there's going to be people across the board that need all different kinds of considerations. And that certainly could play into employee morale issues if employees think that you're not being consistent in enforcing the policy. And despite the federal, state, and local guidance that all strongly advocates for the vaccine as safe and effective, we all know there's still skeptics. Quite frankly, there's individuals out there who have no intention of ever getting vaccinated, regardless of whether the FDA gives full approval. And it's true that while we are in the emergency authorization stage, there are still questions about the long-term effects of the vaccine. You may have more skeptics in the workplace than you know, which kind of folds back into the issue of enforcement. It may be impossible from an operations perspective for you to discipline all of those employees who are refusing the vaccine. And certainly if you're going to get in a situation where you've got mass discipline or mass terminations because people are refusing the vaccine, you're going to have the ripple effect with employee morale issues, which is never fun to have to deal with. There's no shortage of stress in the workplace right now, and we've all been working under less than desirable conditions for the past year, and we've all got employees who are struggling both mentally and emotionally. So while the vaccine is a welcome development for many, many people, not everybody feels the same. And I think it is important that when we're thinking about an employer-mandated vaccine, that we try taking those considerations into account so that we're making the best decisions for our workforce. So now that we've covered kind of the practical and legal considerations, I want to, and if any of those have perhaps convinced you that maybe you need to hit the pause button on mandating the vaccine, now's a good time to think about the alternatives, because there are several alternatives that could be just as effective in reaching your goal of having a fully or mostly fully vaccinated workplace that don't necessarily require a mandate or a requirement that your employees go out and get the vaccine. A good starting point to increasing the number of employees who volunteer for the vaccine is through simple education. There's no shortage of good resources available for individuals to educate themselves on the benefits of obtaining the vaccine. And you as employers can certainly make sure your employees know where those resources are and have those resources available to them so that they can become more educated and make the decision on their own. The CDC website is a good example. The CDC website contains frequently asked questions about the vaccine, a section on deciphering the myths from the facts, and there's a wealth of information about the different types of vaccines, how they work, and what an individual can expect when they're going to obtain the vaccine, and then the side effects from it. The state and local public health websites have similar information. And I'm sure you've all heard stories about your family member or your neighbor who's technically eligible for the vaccine and is tried, but they still can't get an appointment. To the extent employers can help make vaccines more accessible, I think you're going to start seeing a larger population of your employees volunteer for the vaccine without the need for an employer mandate. Now, that could mean several things. That could mean coordinating vaccinations through a third party like a local pharmacy or a doctor's office. It could mean bringing the vaccination doses to your workplace and having an on-site vaccine program like many employers do with the flu vaccine. It could mean providing paid time off or time away from work for your employees, maybe where they don't have to use PTO or some other time, so they can leave work and go and get the vaccine. Or it may simply mean providing support to those employees to help them make it easier for them to get an appointment. So as soon as those barriers are eliminated and it's easier, I think we can certainly see voluntary participation will go up. And if encouraging your employees through education and access isn't enough, there's always incentives. We've seen lots of employers start to explore ways to offer incentives, whether it's through contests or giveaways or raffles. Some employers you may have even seen on the news are suggesting that they're going to offer employees money, cold hard cash, for getting vaccinated. If that's the route you're considering, certainly that's an option. My advice to you is just to proceed with caution. There certainly could be legal challenges if these types of incentives exclude people who are unable to get the vaccine. For example, say someone can't get it due to a medical or a religious reason. They may give you pushback on these types of contests and raffles. So that may be a situation where you want to include people in the prize winning that otherwise can't get it because of a medical or a religious reason. Certain incentives, like raffles, for example, may run afoul of other laws that don't fall into the employment realm, such as illegal gambling laws. They may trigger the same laws as one would when you're, betting on Super Bowl teams in the office or doing other kind of raffles or giveaways that you do in the office. I mean, again, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying just be mindful of these other laws that it may trigger and weigh the risks with the benefits, because it may still be worth it for you as a workplace to go forward with these kind of incentives to increase participation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Antonio to talk about ERISA and the potential implications there.
Thanks, Heather. So when implementing an incentive program, there's a few things you want to think about. So on January 7th of this year, the EEOC proposed regulations that an incentive must be de minimis for it to be considered voluntary. So what it means is, what the EEOC is proposing is the size of the incentive may impact whether it's truly voluntary. So examples that the EEOC gives of something being de minimis is a water bottle or a gift card of a nominal amount. Things the EEOC says are not de minimis, things like paying for a gym membership, discount on health insurance premiums, or a raffle for airline tickets for those of us who are willing to get on an airplane. Now again, caution here, because these are only proposed regulations, and if any of us remember, there's a lot of hoops to jump through before proposed regulations become actual regulations. The other thing to remember is the date is January 7th, and that was in the prior administration. So it's unclear what the current Biden administration will do and whether they're going to move forward with these regulations. Now, there are also some ERISA and HIPAA obligations that may be triggered if employers are directly involved with paying for the vaccine and or contracting with a third party to administer the vaccine. So your best bet to avoid these issues is keep an arm's length away. So when you're doing incentives, like Heather said, she made some great points about making the vaccine more accessible. Don't contract directly with a company to bring the company. Don't pay for it yourselves or reimburse for it, because now you're getting into essentially your medical plan when you're doing those sorts of things, and they trigger obligations under ERISA and HIPAA. And quite frankly, the last thing employers need right now is to deal with more government regulations and obligations. So when you're thinking of incentives and what incentives may work, think of existing programs, right? What has worked in your workplace before, especially with the flu shot. I know that's a big one, where a lot of employers do provide incentives. And so think about, and you know better than anybody, certainly better than two attorneys on a webinar, what works for your particular company and your employees, and what is has been successful in the past. And then let's talk about practical considerations. We talked about how there could be state laws involved with gambling. We talked about ERISA and HIPAA obligations if you're with vaccine incentives and all those things. But practically speaking, think to yourselves, is the USDOL, the Department of Labor, the IRS going to come after an employer because they provided incentives to employees getting the vaccine? Is that really where they want to spend their time? I would hope not. And I would think, especially under this current administration, they would see some type of value. And then the other thing is, how would they find out? Well, they're going to find out, like a lot of times, employees complain. And so if you have a policy set up or incentive set up and do so in a thoughtful way that are taking into account, like Heather said, persons who may not be able to participate because of medical or religious reason, and making sure they are allowed to participate in some way, you reduce that risk. And the other thing to consider is the cold hard cash. I like that term that Heather used, or giving gift cards. That's considered taxable income to the employee. So when you're discussing how much to give, think about that. And again, it all goes back to the practical. Is the IRS going to come after you because you gave a $25 Amazon or Starbucks gift card? I don't think so. But again, as lawyers, we have to at least advise you on what the law says. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Heather to talk about considerations with a unionized workforce.
Thanks, Antonio. Employers with unionized workforces have additional considerations before they roll out any mandate of the COVID-19 vaccine. Unless mandating, the first step is really looking at your collective bargaining agreement. Unless mandating the vaccine falls specifically within a collective bargaining agreement's management rights or other clause in an existing CBA that it's already contemplated situations involving vaccines, the topic is likely a mandatory subject of bargaining. And even if specifically included in the CBA already, you may still need to bargain over the effects of any vaccine program or requirement. So if you're in this situation, don't wait to start bargaining until the vaccine is widely available or your employees are eligible for the vaccine. Start now, because negotiations could be contentious and protracted. When I refer to the need to bargain about the effects of any vaccine program or requirement, here are some examples of what that may include. It may include the payment for time it takes to obtain the vaccine, or whether time off from work will be provided. It may include talking about the time frame within which employees need to obtain the vaccine. It may include talking about what will occur if an employee becomes sick from obtaining the vaccine. And it should also include the consequences for employees who refuse the vaccine. Now, even in a non-union environment, there may be certain protections afforded employees under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. Now, remember, that act provides employees may engage in concerted activities for the mutual aid and protection of one another. So as you can imagine, if employees come together to protest a mandatory vaccination requirement or to speak out against it and express their concerns, that may be concerted organized activity that would be protected under the National Labor Relations Act. So just be mindful of that.
All right, so before we turn it over to some questions, I want to go through some really big takeaways from today. One is, if you're going to mandate the vaccine, think about, consider your goal. What is your goal of mandating employees get the COVID vaccine, and whether a mandatory policy is necessary to achieve that goal? I have young kids, so does Heather. Some of you may. We all know that sometimes you get more with sugar than you do with vinegar. Okay, so think about that. Consider alternatives to mandating the vaccine. Heather went through some of those. But if you decide that you still want to mandate it, then maybe think about, do I have to mandate it of my entire workforce? Or should I limit it to high-risk positions, positions that involve facing, maybe the public more than others? Are there certain sites that are more dangerous than others? Those sorts of things. Have a detailed policy, laying out expectations, procedures, consequences. You wouldn't, you wouldn't, or you shouldn't, if you're rolling out an attendance policy, you wouldn't have, don't be late or tardy or you'll be in trouble, right? Most attendance policies have clearly laid out, here's the expectations, here's the call-off procedure, here's how soon or what happens if you don't call off in a certain amount of time. Here are the consequences. And then sometimes they'll say, and if you need accommodations, let us know, okay? That's the type of detailed policy you need. You employers, and I have a lot of clients calling me and saying, I want to mandate, and they're not thinking a lot of this through. So you're going to want to have a detailed policy. You're going to want to go through and say, okay, if we get these questions, let's educate our managers who are going to be getting these questions on how to respond, okay? So that's going to be very, very important and absolutely critical. And then finally, as we said before, legally you're required to accommodate employees who cannot be vaccinated because of a disability or sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance. Now, here are some helpful links that we talked about today. So one is the EEOC guidance I talked about, OSHA's COVID-19 guidance. Now, OSHA's guidance is very broad, but the parts about the COVID-19 vaccine are towards the end of that webpage on that link. As Heather said, the CDC has some credible sources of information about the vaccine. And then the emergency use authorization fact sheets that are given to people before they get the vaccine is there as well, okay? So I do see we have some questions. So I'm gonna go through some of these questions. One question is, can you poll employees to see how many are wanting to get the vaccine if you are not mandating it? Yes, you absolutely can do that. Again, you would not want to ask the why. So it could be simple yes or no question, and that'll help you. And that's really a great way, if it's logistically possible, to get a sense of, okay, before I start implementing these policies, how many of my employees are planning on getting the vaccine? So the answer is yes, you can do that.
All right, I see a question here. Can we ask employees for a copy of their shot card for their COVID-19 shot? Yes, we certainly can ask employees if they've received the shot and to provide proof of that. The caution here is that's confidential medical information. It should be kept confidential like you would keep any other medical record confidential.
And then another question, how do I determine a valid reason for not getting the vaccine and furthermore giving an incentive to get it? So we talked earlier about legally what are reasons for employees that may not be able to get the vaccine. So we talked about medical accommodations for disabilities and religious accommodations. Absent those and other accommodations for protected classes, so there might be not just religion, but ancestry, national origin reasons, I'm not sure. But absent those reasons, okay, you can mandate someone to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, if you're looking at incentives, I think when Heather, feel free to jump in. When we're talking about incentives, we were maybe suggesting incentive programs. So it may not necessarily be a one-person incentive. You know, Heather indicates she doesn't want to get the vaccine, and I say, hey, Heather, I'll give you a $25 Starbucks gift card if you do. I think, you know, and your better bet is to have a more broad vaccine, or I'm sorry, incentive to get the vaccine, such as a program, as opposed to doing it on a one-off. Especially, you avoid, you know, people are saying, you know, I was treated differently for, you know, X, Y, and Z reasons.
Mm-hmm. I'm just scrolling through the questions. Antonio, there's a question here. How do I determine a valid reason for not getting the vaccine? We haven't covered that, have we?
Yeah, I did, and that's, you know, what I said is you know, it's really limited to obligations under the ADA and Title VII with making accommodations for disabilities and things like closely held religious beliefs. Aside from that, Heather, do you have any other thoughts to add?
No, I think, you know, when it comes to talking about medical accommodations and particularly religious and sincerely held religious beliefs, you know, I always advise to kind of tread lightly. I mean, we don't always, and everybody has their own personal beliefs, and I tend to think we should give employees the benefit of the doubt, and you know, give them the benefit of the doubt if they're coming and saying that, you know, they have this concern and this is why they don't want the vaccine. And unless you've got some piece of information that, you know, really does tell you that this just isn't legitimate, I think it's an area where you should tread lightly.
And it looks like the final question, and this kind of brings it back to the very beginning. Can we make it mandatory that all of our employees get the vaccine? The answer right now is yes, with the caveats that we all talked about, that Heather and I talked about throughout the presentation. So accommodations, OSHA considerations, and things along those lines. But yes, right now, you can mandate it. And then of course, Heather talked about some of the practical considerations to think about. Before I turn it, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think what we're going to see as the vaccine becomes more widely available, there's going to be more guidance, whether it's from the CDC, the Department of Labor, OSHA, the EEOC. We're going to see more guidance on this, and the answers to some of these questions may become clearer.
Okay. Oh, the one just came in. It may, if we are not mandating the vaccine, can we ask to see the shot card if they do receive it? Again, I think this piggybacks what Heather said earlier is, yes, that you can ask for a copy of the shot card. Again, the risk is don't ask the follow-up question. If you didn't get it, then, you know, why? But yes, you can currently under, based on the guidance we've received, you can ask it. Again, to Heather's point, you know, these things might change. So this is a fluid situation, just like COVID-19 has been. So you really want to stay up on, you know, if there's been any new guidance or changes. So before I turn it back over to Anna, what I want to say is, I want to thank HR Simple for having us here today. I want to thank all of you for attending. I hope you all benefited from participating from today's webinar. And if you have any questions or need anything, feel free to contact Anna or Heather and I, and we'd be happy to assist. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Anna.
Thanks, Antonio. And thank you, Heather, as well, for taking the time to present for us today. We greatly appreciate it. Got all of our answers, or all of our questions answered. If you do have any additional questions, my email is up on the screen, and I'd be happy to forward those along to the attorneys. And the SHRM credit is up on the slide for anyone that'd like to copy that down and claim their credit. The slides and a recording of the webinar will be emailed to you along with the SHRM code by end of business tomorrow. Thanks for your participation today, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Bye-bye.